World leaders from rich countries really want to solve global inequality, right? Wrong. If you listen to them, you'd think they do.
Inequality is exploding.
The United States is the world's largest giver in the world by far of foreign aid.
Rich governments do give more than $130 billion in aid each year to poor countries. But the truth is, the aid narrative is a lie. It hides the brutal reality about how the global economy actually works. I was born in Eswatini, a small country in southern Africa, and I studied in the US. I spent much of my life analyzing global inequality. Global inequality describes the income gap between rich countries, sometimes referred to as the global north, and the poorer regions of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, often referred to as the global south. It's a huge gap. Now, we all know that during the colonial period, the global north plundered the south for its own enrichment: gold, silver, land, slaves, and labor, generating a huge income gap between north and south. Now that the colonial era is over, you'd think the gap is closing. But guess what? It's not. In fact, today, it's 4 times bigger than it was in the 1950s. So why is inequality increasing if so-called generous rich countries give so much aid? It's because they give aid with one hand, taking much more with the other. Let's break it down. Each year, about $2 trillion flows from the global north to the global south. That's aid, loans, foreign investments, everything. But you know what? $5 trillion actually flows back in the opposite direction, from the global south to the global north. That means that the north takes a net total of $3 trillion from the south every year. That's 24 times the aid budget that the south receives. It's a huge transfer of wealth from poor countries to rich countries. How is this happening? First, through often shady financial activities, from tax evasion and illicit money transfers involving big multinational companies, to interest payments on debts that have already been paid off many times over. Second, through international trade rules designed to benefit rich countries, allowing them to extract labor and resources from poor countries at artificially low prices. The consequences are mind-blowing. Get this, the people of the global south contribute most of the labor and the resources that go into the world economy. But the poorest 60% of humanity receives only 5% of all of the new income that's generated by global economic growth each year. The rest goes straight to the already rich. Sounds complex and totally unfair, right? The point is, rich nations grow rich at the expense of the rest of the world. So what makes this possible in the first place? Power imbalances. Basically, richer nations of the global north, I'm talking the US, UK, Germany, and France, but also Canada, Australia, Japan, and others, get to control international trade in their own interests. Take the World Trade Organization, for example, which sets the rules of international trade. Technically, it's one nation, one vote. But in reality, rich nations have all of the bargaining power. It's like a monopoly. The same rich countries also have almost all of the voting power at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. At the IMF, the US alone has 16% of the votes and veto power over all major decisions. But all of the countries of the global south combined, home to about 85% of the world's population, have less than 50% of the votes. In other words, people in developing countries have only about 1/10 of the votes that people in rich countries have on a per capita basis. It's a huge and even racist imbalance, kind of like a global apartheid right at the heart of our international institutions. Rich nations have leveraged this power to prevent poor nations from using progressive policies like tariffs and subsidies to develop their own industries. And the irony is, those are the very same policies that rich nations themselves once used for their own growth. Historically, it hasn't always been this way. During the colonial period, the global south was forced to serve as a source of raw materials, slaves, and cheap labor for the north. But by the 1950s, poor countries had freed themselves from colonialism. They were electing their own leaders, introducing land reforms, social spending, and subsidies for their domestic industries. And it worked. It was a development miracle for the South.
This decade is the decade of African independence.
Now, you might think that major powers would be happy about this. After all, they claim to be all for development. Wrong again. They were not happy. The rich North was losing access to the cheap labor and precious resources they'd enjoyed under colonialism. So they intervened. And by the 1980s, they had reimposed the old colonial logic on the global south. So, how did they do it? First of all, with coups in Iran, Guatemala, the Congo, and so on. They toppled democratic leaders and replaced them with dictators that would serve their economic interests. Then, by leveraging their power as creditors, to force global south countries to reverse their progressive reforms, basically kicking away the ladder to development. The aid narrative obscures the truth. Aid is actually flowing in reverse. Rich countries aren't developing poor countries. It's poor countries that are developing rich ones. Colonialism never ended. It just changed form. But it doesn't have to be this way. Inequality is not a natural fact. It's an artifact, a consequence of power. We need to reverse the assumption that aid is the solution and change the rules of the game to make the global economy fairer for the world's majority, so they have a real say in the decisions that affect them. Want real solutions? Democratize global governance to give the South a fair share of voting power. Cancel old debts. End illicit financial flows and resource thefts. Allow poor countries to use subsidies and tariffs to develop their own economies. And set a global minimum wage so that workers in the South receive a fair share of the value they produce. Poor countries don't need charity, they need justice.